welcome to the second collection of my videos about the German World War II military planes. And again, we will include many interesting designs. If you haven't seen the first collection, you should check it out, as that video also features some of the most prominent German designs of the era. See the link in the description. But now, without further ado, let's jump in. Chapter 1. The Dornier Do 17. The story of this aircraft starts in 1932, when the first specifications were sent to Dornier to design a high-speed mail plane for the German Lufthansa, which needed to be able to carry light loads or 6 passengers. In the next year, the newly formed RLM issued the designation Do 17 for the planned aircraft and ordered the first prototypes. At the end of the same year, they issued new specifications for a new, high-speed cargo aircraft with special equipment. This of course meant military applications, but as many other German aircraft developed in the early 1930s, it was disguised as a civilian design, as Germany under the Versailles Treaty was not allowed to build bombers. The same happened with the Heinkel HG-111, which started its life as a passenger plane, and the first models entered service with the Lufthansa as airliners. But as it's well known by now, later it became the main German bomber of World War II. The original design of the Do 17 featured a conventional single tail, and they kept working on the first prototype even though wind tunnel tests showed some problems with the stability. But in parallel, work started on the dual tail variation as well. The first prototype, still featuring the original tail, was finished in November 1934, and made its maiden flight at the end of the month. The aircraft used 2 BMW inline engines, each of them producing 750 horsepower. Landing accidents slowed down the testing, as the landing gear continuously caused problems, as it collapsed twice, damaging the aircraft. The second prototype was finished in May 1935, and featured the new modified twin tail, and the V1 and V2 were tested and evaluated together by the RLM. The next V3 model also used the twin tail design. The Lufthansa tested the new plane in October the same year, but the results of the tests were different from what Dornier wanted. The type was actually rejected by the Lufthansa, as the plane was too cramped for passengers thanks to its narrow fuselage, and its operating costs were too high. It seemed this will be the end of the project, and the 3 prototypes were put in storage. But a few months later, a Lufthansa pilot, who was a Dornier employee as well, flew one of the prototypes and experienced how nimble it was, and he stated it would make a great fast bomber. Word about his experience made its way into the RLM, and more prototypes were ordered. The planes were tested extensively again, but now for a completely different goal, as potential bomber candidates. During 1936, several different prototypes were tested. Though the V1 crashed in December 1935, the V2 model, now converted to military specifications, started its test in May 1936. The V5 prototype was built with Hispano-Suiza engines, but all the other prototype models used the original BMW engines, except the V12 and V13, which were testbeds for the Daimler DB600 engines. The testing showed good flight characteristics, and the RLM decided to place a production order for the type. The V9 prototype was selected as the base for the first Do 17E production series, which entered service mid-1937. But several additional prototypes were built up to that point, the last one being the V21. Though the most well-known version of the Do 17 is the late Model Z variant with its short glazed nose, but the early models were much more conventional, and the signature look only appeared after the first combat experiences with the type. The first E1 variant featured 2 machine guns as defensive armament, and was able to carry 500 kg of bomb load. It was equipped with 2 BMW inline engines, and the top speed of this model was 330 km an hour. Its reconnaissance variant, the Do 17 F1, was very similar to the E1, but it featured cameras on the bottom of the fuselage. The V8 prototype variant, renamed MV1 and using 1000 horsepower Daimler DB600 engines, performed a high-speed test on July 1937 in Switzerland at the military aircraft competition, reaching a top speed of 457 km an hour. Though this model was modified for speed demonstration, its performance was still very successful and led to many foreign orders. Only the MV1 model used the Daimler engines, and the following MV2 and MV3 were built with the Bramo 323 radial engines. These variants became the prototypes for the Do-17M version, after the decision that the Daimler engines should be reserved for fighter planes. This led to the creation of the Do-17M bomber variant and the Do-17P reconnaissance variants, both using the Brahmo radial engines. The M variant featured one additional machine gun compared to the E version, and its bomb load was raised to 1000 kg. The next S and U variants were both used the Daimler DB601 engines, but both were very limited series. They featured the new redesigned airframe, where the cockpit was raised and more glazed for better visibility, and the nose of the aircraft shortened and also extensively glazed. Only 3 were built from the S variant and 12 from the 5-seat U variant. Interestingly, the export version of the plane, the Do-215, was upgraded with 1075 horsepower Daimler DB601 engines. This improved the performance substantially, but these variants actually never reached the buyers, as the Luftwaffe took over these deliveries. The next Z variant used a redesigned airframe, but reverted back to the 900 horsepower Brahmo 323A1 engines, and featured a 4th crew member and an additional defensive machine gun in an underbelly gondola. However, the added weight on the Z1 version led to its being underpowered, and thus the bomb load was cut back to 500 kg. But it was quickly followed by the Z2 variant featuring the newer Brahmo 323P1 engines, producing 1000 horsepower each, and the bomb load was raised back to the full 1000 kg again, and the defensive armament was now 6 machine guns. Though having only 4 crew members, these cannot all fire at the same time. The Z3 variant featured 2 automatic cameras for reconnaissance flights and 500 kg of bomb load. The Z4 was a trainer version, and the Z5 was similar to the Z3 but with added flotation equipment. The Z7 and Z10 variants became night fighter versions. The Z7 featured the solid nose section of the Ju-88C, as the cross-section of the Do-17 and the Ju-88 was very similar. It mounted 3 7.92mm machine guns and one 20mm cannon, but this variant was very short-lived, and the following Z10 received a completely new nose, mounting 4 machine guns and 2 20mm cannons. Still, only 9 of these were built. The Do-17 was 15.8 meters long, with a wingspan of 18 meters. It had an empty weight of 5,210 kilograms, and a maximum takeoff weight of 8,839 kilograms. It used 2 Brahmo 323P radial engines, producing 1,000 horsepower each. With these engines, it could reach a top speed of 410 km an hour and a cruise speed of 300 km an hour. It had a combat range of 660 km with a full bomb load, or 1000 km with 500 kg of bombs. The service ceiling of the plane was 8,200 meters. Its defensive armament consisted of 6 machine guns, and its maximum bomb load was 1000 kg. The mass production of the type started in late 1936, and the first plane started to arrive to the units in early 1937. Soon after, in March, the first Do-17s already arrived to Spain as a combat test in support of the nationalist forces. In this conflict, the bombers fared well, as their speed was high enough to avoid most fighter planes, but still their first loss happened in April, when a Republican side I-15 shot down one of them. The experiences in Spain showed the need for stronger defensive armament and several other modifications. This led to the creation of the short-lived S variant in 1938, with a redesigned fuselage featuring a more bulged lower section to accommodate a crew member and a rearward-firing machine gun. The shorter nose received extensive glazing, and the cockpit was raised and more glazed for better visibility. But the Spanish Civil War also showed the shortcomings of the Do-17, as the HG-111, similarly tested in the conflict, was just as fast as the Dornier plane, but its bomb load was almost 2 times more, depending on the variant. The short-lived S variant was quickly followed by the Z version, which became the definitive Do-17. When World War II broke out, the units using the type were equipped with a mixture of M and Z models. They were heavily used in Poland, mostly in low-level attacks, as the more robust radial engine made the type less vulnerable in low-level missions. Some of them flew on the attack on Norway, but the next larger-scale operation they participated in was the invasion of France and the Low Countries. In these operations, the Do-17s were used heavily, attacking airfields, communication centers, and supply depots. After the Battle of France was over, the type was used again during the Battle of Britain, first attacking shipping over the Channel in July and August, then they switched over attacking airfields and radar installations on the east coast of England. The Dorniers again were used in low-level attacks, and they destroyed many British planes on the ground, but also suffered considerable losses in their missions. During the operation against the British was the first time the Dorniers, just like most German planes, encountered top-of-the-line fighters, like the Spitfires and Hurricanes, which with their high speed and heavy armament caused a lot of losses to the German bomber formations. Altogether, some 150 Do-17s were lost during the Battle of Britain. By mid-1940, the production of the Do-17 stopped, as the more modern Ju-88 and Do-217 entered service, but the type still remained in use. Similarly to many German aircraft that became obsolete and suffered losses in the Western Front, the Dorniers were used on the Balkans and the Eastern Front, where they faced less opposition in the air. Over the Balkans, in April 1941, 102 of them participated in the attack against Belgrade. They also took part in the Battle of Crete in May the same year. By the time of Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, most units converted to the newer Ju-88 models, and only a few Do-17s stayed in frontline service. They still found some success at the end of June, when enjoying the German air superiority, they attacked the Soviet forces preparing for a counterattack. But again, their limited bomb load and range meant the days of the Do-17s were numbered, and they were slowly phased out from the bomber role. The remaining planes were still used, but not for combat operations, but as training aircraft and as glider tugs. They also participated in testing new technologies, like the Z model on the picture, carrying an experimental ramjet engine. The last Do-17 units participating in combat operations were the night fighter variants, which stayed in service until early 1933. Other nations that used the Do-17 included Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, Finland, Hungary, Romania, Italy, Spain, and interestingly the United Kingdom, who used two captured Do-17s, which originally were used by King Peter to escape Yugoslavia. Originally this aircraft was built for speed, and later pressed into combat role because of its performance. But it was a victim of its own design, as it couldn't carry enough ordnance, and its short range was a big drawback. It was quickly overtaken by more advanced designs during World War II, but nonetheless it was an interesting aircraft. Chapter 2. The Messerschmitt Me 210. The story of this aircraft starts in 1934, when the RLM started looking for a new design, which could be used in many different roles, as a long-range escort fighter, heavy fighter, or bomber. This was the original Kampfzerstörer project. 3 companies got into the final rounds of this tender: Messerschmitt with their Bf-110 design, Henschel with the HS-124, and Focke-Wulf with the FW-57 model. But less than a year later, the specifications were changed, and the 2 roles were separated, to the Zerstörer, destroyer or heavy fighter, and the Schnellbomber or fast bomber roles. The Bf-110 won the competition for the heavy fighter design, as it was much smaller and more nimble than its rivals, thanks to the design choice of carrying the payload externally. A modified version of the plane, the Bf-162, was entered for the Schnellbomber role as well, but it lost out to the Junkers Ju-88. Nonetheless, it was accepted for the heavy fighter role, and the first pre-production Bf-110 was delivered in January 1937. The Luftwaffe had high hopes for the type, but the heavy fighter soon started to show its shortcomings. During the first campaigns of World War II, it proved itself a capable ground attack aircraft, but its range was too short and it lacked maneuverability, which during the Battle of Britain became a problem, facing the agile British fighters. But even before the production variants of the Bf-110 were finished, Messerschmitt already worked on the planned successor, which was hoped to surpass the heavy fighter in every aspect, or so it was planned. And this design was the Me-210. Let's take a minute to explain why the Bf-110 had the Bf prefix, and the following Me-210 became Me, as the naming caused much confusion during and since World War II. The company, which was later known as Messerschmitt AG, started its life in 1916 as BFW, Bayerische Flugzeugwerke. Willy Messerschmitt joined the company in 1927 as chief designer, and though BFW went through a hard time in the early 1930s, when Messerschmitt designed the very successful Bf-109, they returned to the spotlight, and he became the favorite of the Nazi Party. Soon in 1938, BFW was reconstructed as Messerschmitt AG, with Willy Messerschmitt as chairman. From then on, the designs used the Me prefix, instead of the Bf one. Now after this little detour, back to the history of the aircraft. As the Bf-110 started entering service, the RLM already set out new specifications for its future replacement in late 1938. For the new specifications, Messerschmitt entered the new Me-210 design, while its competitors were the AR-240 from Narrated and the less known AGO AO-225. The AO-225 was a very ambitious design, planned to use just one engine in the fuselage, driving two propellers on the wings through a system of drive shafts. It proved to be too complicated, so it was dropped early. This was the last design of the AGO company, which was then taken over by Junkers. The Narrated design, though it was seen as a good candidate, was given low priority, but still prototypes were ordered for evaluation in May 1939. It was a quite ambitious design, with remote-controlled defensive guns and a fully pressurized cockpit. Only 15 units were built from this type, and the project was eventually cancelled due to various problems, but the finished planes were used in different roles during the war. The Air Ministry trusted the Messerschmitt design the most, as it was in sense a development of the earlier Bf-110, even sharing some of the parts. On the other hand, it introduced some quite radical changes compared to the earlier heavy fighter. Its nose was shortened and the cockpit moved back on the fuselage. While the Bf-110 carried its payload externally, the Me-210 received an internal bomb bay under the nose. And similarly to the Narrated design, it featured remote-controlled defensive guns on both sides of the aircraft. These remote-controlled guns were seen as marvels of modern technology, giving a wide arc of fire, fired electrically, and using contact breakers to prevent damaging the tail. But as it turned out, in reality the aiming of the guns was very hard. They had constant problems with the remote control, and the guns themselves often jammed in the tight space. Also notice the original Me-210 design carried over the twin tail from its predecessor. On paper, the new Me-210 design had very good performance, as its speed was comparable to lighter single-engine fighters. So high was the confidence that the Messerschmitt design will be successful, that the RLM placed an order for 1,000 aircraft, even before the first flight of the type. Which, as later turned out, was a mistake. The first prototype made its maiden flight in September 1939, about a year after the specifications were announced, and immediately problems were found with the plane, as it lacked stability both vertically and horizontally, and it had a tendency to stall in tight turns. The first attempted fix was to modify the tail. On the V2 variant, the twin tail was dropped, and a traditional single fin tail was designed. This was the first variant that featured the defensive armament, though at that time just as a mock-up. The test flights continued with the V2 model, but despite the new tail, the stability issues remained, and resulted in the crash of the plane in September 1940. Though the problems with the stability of the aircraft persisted, the RLM was too invested in the project, and desperate to push the new aircraft in production. So the first pre-production units were finished by mid-1940, and delivered to the first squadrons for testing. To try to work out the problems on the aircraft, later more than 20 production units were also sent to help the testing, but without any success. It was clear the aircraft needs a major redesign. The engineers trying to find a solution to the instability tried several different modifications. Amongst them was to increase the length of the fuselage by some 90 cm to a full length of 12.27 meters, which finally seemed to help with the stability of the aircraft. The already delivered planes still suffered many accidents though, and the constant interruptions to the production to implement different modifications resulted in very low numbers built. In 1941, only 94 of these aircrafts were delivered, and finally in April 1942, the order was given to stop the production until a permanent solution is found to fix the design, and instead restart the BF-110 production with the G model, using Daimler DB605 engines. Though the type was soon replaced by the upgraded ME-410 variant, which incorporated all the fixes and more, the ME-210 didn't actually reach the end of its production yet. The C variant, which featured the new modifications on the airframe and used the stronger DB605 engines, was deemed satisfactory by the Hungarian authorities, and they purchased a license to build the type themselves. The tools were supplied by Messerschmitt to the Hungarians, and the first license-built ME-210C A1 variants rolled out from the factory in early 1943. They used the longer fuselage and the new leading-edge slats on the wings. The engines used were also Hungarian-made license-built Daimler DB605s. By the agreement, 1/3 of the production was used by the Hungarian Air Force, and 2/3 were diverted to the Luftwaffe. The production in Hungary ended in mid-1944, but by that time, additional 267 aircraft were finished. The ME-210A1 was the heavy fighter variant, featuring two 20mm cannons and two 7.92mm machine guns. It used the 1350 horsepower DB601E engines. The A2 was a fighter bomber variant, with similar armament as the A1, but it could carry 2000 kg of bombs internally and under the wings. One of the A2 models was delivered to Japan on a U-boat, where it was assembled and evaluated. The B1 variant was a photoreconnaissance version, but only 4 units were built. The C1 and C2 variants had similar roles as the A1 and A2, but used the more powerful Daimler DB605 engines, producing 1475 horsepower each, and featured the improved airframe and new slats on the wings. The Hungarian license-built planes received the ME-210C A1 designation. This Hungarian variant had a planned bomber-destroyer version, using a 40mm Bofors cannon in the bomb bay, and rocket launchers under the wings. Only 3 of them were modified like this before the manufacturing plant was bombed. Interesting fact that they were working on a proximity-fused air-to-air rocket as well, but it wasn't finished before the fall of the country. The ME-210 was 12.37 meters long, with a wingspan of 16.3 meters. It had an empty weight of 7,070 kilograms and a maximum takeoff weight of 9,705 kilograms. The plane used 2 Daimler DB605 engines, producing 1,475 horsepower each. With these engines, it could reach a top speed of 580 km an hour, a range of around 1,200 km, and it had a service ceiling of 8,900 meters. The plane's armament consisted of 2 20mm cannons and 2 7.92mm machine guns in the nose, plus additional 2 30mm machine guns in the side blisters, and it could carry 1,000 kilograms of bombs. The first production models of the ME-210 started to arrive to the units in April 1942, and the rush development and unsolved problems immediately showed. The instability of the plane made it a very bad gun platform, and none of the pilots liked to fly it. When the ME-210s met the British RAF fighters over England in September, it quickly became clear that they stand no chance against the more nimble single-engine planes. They operated over the Mediterranean, flying from Sicily, and in North Africa as well, where they flew successful ground attack missions, but also suffered losses from the Allied fighters. Most units using them were soon equipped with Junkers Ju-88s, and later with the newer ME-410 models instead. Only around 90 of these planes were delivered to the units, and the partially finished airframes were put into storage when the Air Ministry instructed Messerschmitt to cancel the production until they can fix the problems. When the solution to the instability was found, with implementing the longer reworked fuselage and the new leading edge slats on the wings, most of the already built Me-210A models were retrofitted as well. The later CA-1 models, manufactured at Hungary, had better flight characteristics with the longer fuselage, reworked wings, and the DB605 engines, and they added a few hundred to the total number of planes manufactured. These were mostly used on the Eastern Front, and the Hungarian pilots actually liked them, though they were never considered an easy-to-fly aircraft. But the reputation of the Me-210 was already very bad, and only around 350 units entered service altogether. The type had a very short and rather shameful service record, and it damaged the reputation of the Messerschmitt company, and as a result, Willy Messerschmitt was forced to resign from the chairman position. The upgraded Me-410 variant was a more successful aircraft, but we will look at that plane in a separate video. Chapter 3: The Focke-Wulf Fw. The story of this aircraft starts in the mid-1930s, when long-range flights were not common and transatlantic flights used flying boats with several stops. The flying boat was a necessity, as most aircraft at that time lacked the range to make the flight without stops, and there were no large airfields on the way crossing the Atlantic, so an aircraft capable of landing near any island was the obvious choice. In early 1936, Kurt Tank, the lead designer at Focke-Wulf, who later was involved in many successful projects like the FW-190 fighter plane, presented his idea to the board of the German Lufthansa to develop a long-range, modern airliner, which can fly to New York without any stops. Lufthansa was interested, and in June 1936 issued specifications to build the aircraft. The design was ambitious for the time, a big 4-engined all-metal monoplane with a large wingspan to be able to cruise at high altitude at around 3,000 meters or 10,000 feet. The design of the aircraft advanced well, and the first prototype, powered by 4 American Pratt & Whitney Hornet engines, made its maiden flight just a bit more than a year later, in July 1937. The second and third prototypes followed right after, and these examples used 720 horsepower BMW engines, and the third aircraft became Adolf Hitler's personal transport, after some modifications. The aircraft also featured a rather unusual landing gear design, which retracted forwards into the engine nacelles. This design was chosen as in case of a malfunction, the slipstream could help opening the gear before landing. The first 3 prototypes were followed by another 3, before the first small batch of the A0 production aircrafts. The original V1 prototype, renamed FW200S1, performed several record-breaking flights as a civil airliner. It flew from Berlin to New York in a non-stop flight in August 1938, making the trip in 24 hours 36 minutes. 3 months later in November, it flew to Tokyo in 42 hours with a few stops. This flight caught the attention of the Japanese airline Dai Nippon and also the Imperial Japanese Navy. Sadly, the aircraft was lost in an accident on the return flight, when on the approach to Manila, the fuel supply to the engines was cut off, and the pilot had no choice but to ditch the aircraft in the bay. Luckily, no one was hurt in the incident, and though later the aircraft was recovered, it was damaged beyond repair. Despite the accident, the flight to Japan was the first step for this plane to get into military service, as the Japanese Imperial Navy wanted to order one as a long-range maritime reconnaissance aircraft. This led to the development of the V10 version, an armed long-range reconnaissance variant of the airliner. This variant featured increased fuel capacity and 3 7.92mm machine guns, 1 in a dorsal turret and 2 in the gondola under the fuselage. This aircraft, however, never made it to Japan, as the war broke out in Europe. When the Luftwaffe need for a long-range reconnaissance aircraft emerged, they had to realize that none of the German planes designed for long-range operations will be available anytime soon. The Heinkel HG-177 was well behind schedule and was plagued with problems, so the FW200 came in the picture, as it was already in production, had the required range, and the V10 version was already modified for long-range reconnaissance, following the Japanese order. The man who played a big role in getting the Condor in military service was Hauptmann Edgar Petersen, who commanded the Luftwaffe flight school near Hanover and had his eye on the FW-200 as the only long-range alternative available in numbers. These events led to the development of the FW-200C variant. To be able to carry the increased weight coming with the military modifications, the aircraft had to be modified, its airframe strengthened, and it received dual wheels on the undercarriage. 10 of the pre-production FW-200C0 variants were delivered to the Luftwaffe in September 1939. 4 of these were transport variants, and the remaining 6 were armed versions. This pre-production run was quickly followed by other upgraded variants, so let's take a look at those. The following C1 variant received increased armament with a 20mm cannon in the front and capability to carry 1000 kg of bombs. However, the added weaponry, fuel load, and other equipment put a lot of stress on the frame of the aircraft, which was not designed for this, and quite a few early variants simply broke in half on landing. Despite various reinforcements and redesigns, this problem followed the FW-200 during its service. As initially starting its life as an airliner, it was not designed for high G-load maneuvers, especially while carrying a lot of added weight. The C2 variant was basically the same as the C1, with minor modifications to the engine nacelles and bomb racks. But the following C3 version brought a redesign and structural reinforcements to fix the problems. But despite the efforts, the weakness of the airframe was never fully addressed. This variant also featured more powerful 1200 horsepower Brembo engines, and had several sub-variants featuring different dorsal turret types and weaponry. The C4 variant introduced the use of air-to-surface search radar. Though this increased the effectiveness of finding targets, the added weight and drag made this version dangerously slow. Its maximum speed was 330 km an hour at cruise altitude and just 280 km an hour at sea level. But by the time this variant entered service, the Condors, instead of attacking ships themselves, mainly just directed submarines to the targets. The C6 and C8 variants were modified to be able to carry search radars and the Henschel HS-293 anti-ship guided missiles. The Condor was a big aircraft, at 23.45 meters long, with a wingspan of 32.85 meters. It was bigger than a B-17 bomber. It had an empty weight of 17,000 kilograms and a maximum weight of 22,714 kilograms. It was powered by 4 Brembo 323 engines, developing 12,000 horsepower each. The aircraft had a maximum speed of 380 km an hour and a cruise speed of 335 km an hour. It had an impressive range of 3,560 km and a service ceiling of 6,000 meters. Its defensive armament consisted of 4 7.92mm machine guns in various positions, one 30mm machine gun in the rear dorsal turret, and a 20mm cannon at the front of the gondola. It could carry 1,000 kg of bombs internally, or up to 5,400 kg externally. Following the first deliveries of the type at the end of 1939, Kampfgeschwader 40 was established in April 1940 under the command of Hauptmann Edgar Petersen, and the Condors see their first action during the invasion of Norway. Their time to shine came not much later, in mid-1940, after the Battle of France, when they started to fly missions from Bordeaux, scouting the Bay of Biscay up to Ireland and up to the north to Norway. Around this time, the newer C1 version started to arrive. This version had a bigger bomb load, but it was carefully distributed to racks under the wings to avoid overstressing the airframe. Nonetheless, accidents still happened from time to time because of the structural weakness of the aircraft. This was their golden time, and when they earned the name Scourge of the Atlantic, as just in 2 months after June, they claimed 90,000 tons of shipping sunk. And by February 1941, this number grew to an estimated 360,000 tons. In August 1940, though they were not designed for it, these planes were used in conventional bombing role, when they participated in some night bombing raids over the Liverpool area. But they mostly showed their strength in anti-shipping role, and especially when working together with the German submarines. In October 1940, a Condor managed to disable the ocean liner Empress of Britain, and the crippled ship was sunk by U-38 not long after. These attacks were not without danger though, as the FW-200 was only equipped with a very crude bomb sight, so the usual tactic was to bomb from a very low altitude and strafe the ships with their machine guns. But their rule didn't last long, as although slowly, but the Allies started to deploy countermeasures against these attacks. First, they started to arm the merchant ships with defensive guns, and though these were not the most effective weapons, even these could be dangerous to the Condors, considering they had no defensive armor plating, and they were not able to perform swift evasive maneuvers without risking the disintegration of the aircraft. Taken a step further, the Allies introduced the so-called camp ships in the summer of 1941, which, as the name suggests, were equipped with a catapult and could launch a Hurricane fighter plane if needed. The first loss of a Condor to one of these ship-launched fighters happened in August, proving the effectiveness of these tactics. Around this time, the next C2 variant appeared, but only after 8 units built, the manufacturing swapped to the C3 variant, which had its airframe reinforced and introduced more powerful engines and an increased bomb load. By mid-1941, the appearance of Allied escort carriers in the convoys also posed a real danger to the Condors. In December, they lost several planes to Grumman martlets flying from HMS Audacity during an attack on a convoy in the Mediterranean. Because of the Allied defensive efforts, the Condor crews were instructed to avoid combat as possible, and their main task was to guide the U-boats to the target. They shadowed the Allied ships using their long range and transmitted a direction-finding signal for the submarines. Air attacks were only made against soft, defenseless targets. Early 1942 saw the introduction of the C4 version with the air-to-surface vessel radar to help the Condors find targets. In early 1943, 18 of the Condors were sent to the Western Front to help supply the encircled 6th Army at Stalingrad. They flew from Stalino and completed 41 sorties before Stalingrad was lost. 9 of them were shot down during this time, and the remaining aircraft was later sent back to KG-40 at Bordeaux. The FW-200 losses were still rising, thanks to the Allied defensive operations, and the crews were now instructed to avoid attacks under 9,000 feet to avoid anti-aircraft fire, though from this altitude their bombs usually missed the targets. During this year, the C6 and C8 variants were tested to use the handshell HS-293 anti-ship missiles, and some of the Condors were tested for air-launched V1 rockets as well. They started using the new anti-ship missiles, but their success rate was very low, and the FW-200 as long-range reconnaissance aircraft was slowly replaced by the Junkers Ju-290 and the Heinkel HG-177 bombers. By early 1944, the Germans stopped the production of the FW-200 Condor. The maritime missions were drastically reduced because of lack of fuel and Allied air superiority, and after the Normandy landings, the loss of bases in France made the flights over the Atlantic impossible. The Condor stayed in service until the end of the war, but they were relegated back to the transport role. These elegant-looking planes were just modified from a civilian aircraft, but they were very effective in the anti-shipping role, despite all their faults. Though their rule over the Atlantic convoys didn't last long, but long enough to earn them a place between the most interesting World War II aircrafts. Chapter 4. The Dornier Do-217. The story of this bomber leads back to 1932, when Dornier started to work on a new aircraft, initially intended for the fast mail delivery role. This was their Do-17 model, which, similarly to other contemporary German designs, was secretly modified to military use as well. The mass production of this type started in late 1936, and the first planes entered service with the Luftwaffe in early 1937. They participated in the Spanish Civil War, the invasion of Poland, the attack on Norway, and in the Battle of France. But by this time it was clear the plane, which was designed to be fast and nimble, fell short in range and bomb load. But this was not a surprise for the German officials, as in 1937, based on the experiences in the Spanish Civil War, already new specifications were issued by the RLM. they asked for a new twin-engine bomber with both horizontal and dive bombing capabilities, with the emphasis on improved performance and bomb load over the existing designs like the HG-111 or Do-17. Dornier started working on their new design in 1937. They used the Do-17Z model and its export variant, the Do-215, as a starting point, and basically scaled up the earlier design. The new aircraft became longer by 2.4 meters, and its wingspan was extended by 1 meter, and it featured a much bigger bomb bay, able to carry 3,000 kilograms of bombs compared to the 1,000 kilograms on the Do-17 model. But the new plane wasn't just a bigger Do-17, it featured many changes and improvements. It used a reinforced and more streamlined fuselage, and just like the export model, was powered by the Daimler DB601 engines. It also featured a very unique dive brake design, which we will talk about a bit later. Dornier also planned to modify the model for another requirement, asking for a multi-role twin-engine maritime patrol aircraft, which led to an interesting sidetrack from the Do-217 project. These requirements asked for a long-range maritime reconnaissance and bomber plane, which could perform dive bombing as well, as horizontal bombing against ships at the time was extremely inaccurate, showing around 2% hit rate compared to the almost 40% achieved by the Ju-87 dive bombers. Basically, the officials were looking for a siege Stuka and asked for a twin-engine float plane with strong armament, at least 400 km/h speed and 1500 km range. Dornier proposed a modification of the Do-217 design under the P-85 project name. Their maritime patrol plane would have carried two 7.92mm machine guns and two 20mm cannons in the nose, had a reduced bomb load of 1000 kilograms, and instead of wheels, this plane of course would have floats. Eventually, Dornier's proposal lost out to other designs, and after that they concentrated on the land-based version, and presented this variant in June 1938. The first Do-217 V1 prototype was finished in August 1938 and made its maiden flight in October, powered by two 1075 horsepower Daimler DB601 engines. But this model showed quite poor handling and crashed a week later during a test flight. The design showed serious problems with directional stability, but the following prototypes were already in production. So the V2 and V3 models were finished soon with no big modifications apart from switching to the 950 horsepower Junkers Jumo 211 engines. The V4 model was finished early 1939. By this time it was clear the design needed modifications to fix the stability issues, which was achieved by modifying the tail fins and adding slots to their leading edges. The following V5, V6 and V1E models incorporated the fix on the tail, and again featured the Daimler engines. Because the type was very much underpowered with the Jumo and Daimler engines, the RLM wanted something that can provide considerably more power. So the V7 and V8 models were tested with the 1550 horsepower BMW 139 radial power plants. Eventually, the development of these engines was abandoned altogether, so they were changed to the 1580 horsepower BMW 801 models. These engines were used on the V9 variant of the plane, which flew early 1940 and eventually became the base for the production Do-217E variant. This was the first version that featured the deeper front fuselage, and it had one of the largest bomb bays on any World War II German aircraft. Being more than 6 meters long and 1 meter high, it could even accommodate the large 1000 kilogram bombs. Initially, the Do-217 was planned to use wing-mounted dive brakes, similarly to many contemporary aircraft, but that was soon changed to a petal type designed by Arado, mounted in the tail. These were integral parts of the rear fuselage, operated electrically and worked like a parachute. But there were serious concerns that the use of the air brake can overstress the tail, and they were also found to be ineffective on the heavy plane. So work started on different wing-mounted air brakes, and in parallel, a different parachute style for the tail as well. But by late 1940, the dive bombing capability was removed from the requirements, in light of the new, more accurate bomb sights. In late 1939, the RLM already ordered pre-production models from the type in two different configurations, and because this production order was issued before the testing of the more powerful radial engines was concluded, these models again used the Daimler DB601 engines, like the earlier prototypes. 8 units were built from the Do-217 A0 reconnaissance model, and 4 units from the C0 bomber variants. The reconnaissance models can be identified by the bulge under the fuselage, housing the cameras, and these were actually used operationally by the Luftwaffe. The C0 bomber variants were not used in combat, but they participated in bomb sight and engine testing trials. The Do-217 B and D variants were never built, so the E version became the first to enter mass production based on the V9 model. A small pre-production batch of E0 models was completed in late 1940, before deliveries of the mass-produced E1 version started later that year. And if we're talking about different models of the type, let us take a look at its variants. The V1 to V9 models were the original prototypes, with different engine configurations, including the Daimler DB601, the UMO 211, and BMW 139 and 801 models. The A0 pre-production reconnaissance variants used the Daimler DB601 engines and featured a longer bulge under the fuselage to house the cameras. The C0 was the pre-production bomber variant, with Daimler DB601 engines featuring an armament of 5 7.92mm defensive machine guns and one fixed 15mm machine gun in the nose, and it was capable of carrying 3,000 kg of bombs. The E0 was the pre-production bomber variant, using the 1,580 horsepower BMW 801 engines. Similar defensive armament as the C0 version, but an increased bomb load of 4,000 kg. The E1 was the first mass-produced variant, similar to the E0. Deliveries of these models started in late 1940. The following E2 was intended as a dive bomber variant. Its defensive armament was changed to 3 7.92mm and 2 13mm machine guns, plus the 15mm forward-firing one. The E3 variant actually appeared before the E2 and featured increased armor protection for the crew and stronger armament, with 2 extra 7.92mm machine guns, bringing the total up to 7, and replacing the 15mm machine gun with a 20mm cannon in the nose. The E4 version replaced the E2 at the end of 1941, using the newer BMW 801C engines, and because the dive brakes were seen as ineffective, they were usually removed on these models. The E5 model was similar to the E4, but it was modified to be able to carry the HS-293 guided bombs under the wings. The J1 was the first night fighter variant, built with a solid nose, housing 4 7.92mm machine guns and 4 20mm cannons. It had a 3-man crew and reduced bomb load. The J2 night fighter version was similar to the J1, but it introduced the FUG-202 radar, and its bomb bay was deleted altogether. The K1 was the first variant featuring the new nose design, and it used the new 1,700 horsepower BMW 801D engines. These models were intended for night bomber roles. The K2 model was modified to carry the Fritz X guided bombs. The wingspan on these models was extended to 24.5 meters. The K3 model was similar to the K2 variant, but it could carry either the Fritz X or the HS-293 guided bombs. If you would like to know more about the development and use of German guided weapons, be sure to check out my earlier videos covering the HS-293 and the Fritz X guided bombs. The M variant of the Do-217 was modified to use the 1,750 horsepower Daimler DB603 engines, as the BMW engines were in short supply and mostly needed for the FW-190 fighters. The N1 night fighter variant was similar to the J2, but used the Daimler DB603 engines and still retained its bomb bay. Its armament consisted of 4 machine guns and 4 20mm cannons in the nose, and 2 13mm defensive machine guns. The N2 variant was similar to the N1, but its defensive armament was deleted, and instead provisions were made to install 4 20mm cannons firing upwards in a 70-degree angle. The P model was a planned high-altitude variant with a new pressurized nose section and 3-man crew. It used a unique engine system. Its two DB603 engines were supercharged by a third DB605 model built in the fuselage. It started flight tests in June 1942, but eventually the development was abandoned in 1943. Apart from the different variants of the type, the Do-217, similarly to other German aircraft, also had numerous additional equipment kits for various roles and mission types. The Do-217 was 18.2 meters long, with a wingspan of 19 meters. It had an empty weight of 8,950 kilograms and a maximum takeoff weight of 16,480 kilograms. The bomber used two BMW 801 radial engines, each of them producing 1,580 horsepower. With these engines, it could reach a top speed of 516 kilometers an hour and a cruise speed of 410 km an hour. It had a combat range of 2,300 km and a service ceiling of 9,000 meters. The plane's armament consisted of one forward-firing 15mm machine gun, two 13mm machine guns in the ventral and dorsal positions, plus three 7.92mm machine guns firing from the sides. It had a maximum bomb load of 4,000 kilograms, including the internal and external racks, while internally it could carry up to 2,500 kilograms. The first Do-217 models to enter service early 1940 were the A0 reconnaissance models, which were followed by the Bomber E variant by the end of the year. The reconnaissance variants of the type flew many information-gathering missions over the Soviet Union before Operation Barbarossa, while the Bomber variants started patrolling over the North Seas, attacking Allied shipping during 1941, and from 1942 participated in attacks against British cities. During this year, the units using the Do-217 were slowly converted to the newer M and K models and continued to fly missions over England, although they suffered heavy losses during the raids. The type also participated in anti-shipping operations and made good use of the new guided weapons like the Fritz X and HS-293. In August 1943, they managed to damage two ships, the HMS Landguard and HMS Biddeford, and sunk the HMS Ygritte corvette. In 1944, they were flying missions over France, attacking the Allied bridgehead during the Normandy landings, but against the Allied air superiority, they again suffered heavy losses. The type was also used over the Mediterranean, both by the Luftwaffe and the Italian Air Force, who acquired 12 of these planes. But maybe the most infamous mission of the Do-217s happened in September 1943 against their former allies. After the armistice, the Italian fleet sailed out towards Malta to surrender to the Allied forces. The Germans, however, not willing to let this powerful force to fall into the hands of the Allies, sent out 11 Do-217 bombers, carrying Fritz X anti-shipping bombs to intercept them. The three modern Italian battleships, Italia, Roma, and Vittorio Veneto, were attacked by these planes. The Roma was hit and severely damaged by a Fritz X bomb, and soon after, a second hit exploded its magazine. The Italia was also hit, but it was luckier, and only suffered damage from the attacks and managed to continue on her own steam. The Do-217s with the guided bombs were deployed again when the Allies landed in Italy. During the attack, the USS Savannah was hit by a bomb, which exploded under one of her turrets. The ship lost 197 men and was seriously damaged, but managed to stay afloat. The night fighter variant of the type entered service in 1942, but being a big and not particularly nimble plane, they were not very popular between the flight crews and didn't find a lot of success. The Dornier 217 was a very good bomber for its time, but it suffered from the same problems many other German designs of the time. The officials tried to push them into too many different roles. Its other problem was that it didn't really fit into any of the predetermined German aircraft categories. It was too big and slow for the fast bomber role, too small to be a real heavy bomber, and not nimble and fast enough for the night fighter role. So even though it outperformed many of its rivals, it never got the attention it deserves. Chapter 5. The Messerschmitt Me 410. To understand the story of this aircraft, first we have to take a quick look at its predecessor, as the Me 410 was an evolution of the Me 210 design. Its history started in 1937, when the RLM set new specifications, looking for a more modern heavy fighter design which would replace the Bf-110, which just entered service in that year. Actually, as soon as the Bf-110 development ended, and even before the first production variants of the plane were finished, Messerschmitt already worked on such an aircraft, which they imagined as the successor of the 110. And this design was the Me 210. When the RLM set the specifications for the new twin-engined heavy fighter, Messerschmitt entered with this design, and their competitors were the AO225 from AGO and the AR240 model from Arado. From the proposals, the Air Ministry favored the Messerschmitt design, as it was a development of the earlier Bf-110 and shared some parts with it as well. And maybe the fact that Willy Messerschmitt was by far the most favored aircraft designer by the party had something to do with the decision as well. But while the new design was in a sense a more advanced version of the 110, the new aircraft also introduced some radical changes. Unlike its predecessor, the Me 210 carried its payload in an internal bomb bay under the nose, and it also featured remote-controlled defensive guns on both sides of the aircraft. Though the plane used many advanced features, which had very positive reception amongst the officials, but in reality, the remote-controlled guns were a constant source of problems. They often jammed, had problems with the controls, and were hard to aim. The RLM, based on the good track record of Messerschmitt, placed an order for 1,000 aircraft, even before the first flight of the type. But this soon turned out to be a big mistake. The Me 210 first took to the skies in September 1939, and immediately problems were found with the plane. Most of all, it lacked stability, especially when the bomb bay doors were opened during flight. The designers tried different modifications to tackle the stability issues. But even though the problems persisted, despite the different design changes, the RLM was desperate to push the new aircraft into production, and the first units were delivered for field testing in mid-1940. Many of the delivered planes suffered accidents, and production of the type was very slow, thanks to the constant updates and fixes. In 1941, less than 100 of them were delivered, and in April 1942 the production was ordered to stop, until a permanent solution is found to fix the problems. But now back to the story, how the Me 410 was developed. Messerschmitt offered various solutions to fix the problems, including a high-altitude variant, the Me 310. The officials, however, favored another solution, a modified variant of the original Me 210 design, which would offer the least waste in time and resources. This new design incorporated all the changes the designers tried earlier on the Me 210 to fix the stability problems, including a more than 90 cm longer fuselage and a new wing design, which featured leading-edge slats and was built with a constant 5.5-degree sweep. The new aircraft was also planned to use the stronger 1,750 horsepower DB603 engines. This was the Me 410 design, which, though it fixed the problems encountered on the previous design, was still similar enough that the production could continue with minimal obstruction, and even existing Me 210 airframes could be modified to the new standards. This is exactly what happened at first, when in late 1942 6 Me 210 models were modified to the new standards, and the new Me 410 model performed its first flight at the end of the year. Thanks to all the modifications and the more powerful engines, the handling and performance of the Me 410 was much better than its predecessors, and finally better than the Bf-110s. The test flights of the prototypes convinced the RLM, and the new design was quickly ordered in production, and thanks to its similar construction to its predecessor, the first Me 410 models were already delivered in January 1943. The Me 210 and Me 410 look quite similar at first glance, but if we look at their technical specifications, we can highlight the differences. The Me 210 was originally 11.2 meters long, while the later C models featured a longer 12.2 meters fuselage to help with stability. The wingspan of the plane was 16.3 meters. Meanwhile, the Me 410 was 12.48 meters long, with a wingspan of 16.35 meters. And as we mentioned earlier, the Me-410 also featured a new wing design, which had the same 5.5 degree sweep all the way. The Me-210 had an empty weight of 7,070 kilograms and a maximum weight of 9,705 kilograms. The Me-410 was slightly heavier, with 7,518 kilograms empty weight and 9,651 kilograms maximum weight. The Me-210 used two Daimler DB605 engines, producing 1,475 horsepower each, while the Me-410 used the more powerful 1,750 horsepower DB603 models. The Me-210 had a maximum speed of 580 km an hour, while the Me-410 with its stronger engines could reach 624 km an hour speed. The range of the Me-210 was 1,800 km, while the Me-410's range was 2,330 km. And the Me-410 also had a higher service ceiling at 10,000 meters, compared to the 8,900 meters ceiling of the Me-210. Initially, both carried the same armament, with two 20mm cannons and two 7.92mm machine guns in the nose, and two 13mm machine guns in the side blisters. Their bomb load was also similar at 1,000 kilograms. Of course, the armament, range, and speed varied widely between different variants, so let's take a look at those next. The Me-410 had many different variants, and on top of those, they had a confusing array of modification kits and different armament configurations. The Me-410A1 was the basic light bomber variant, armed with two 20mm cannons and two 7.92mm machine guns. The A2 was a planned heavy fighter variant with two 30mm cannons, but it was cancelled. Later it returned with the B variant of the plane. The A3 variant was built as a reconnaissance version, carrying cameras. Early 1944, the B variants appeared, which introduced small changes compared to the A version. The 7.92mm machine guns in the nose were replaced by heavier 13mm ones, and the new variants were planned to use the stronger 1,900 horsepower DB603G engines. But because the production of this engine variant was cancelled in early 1944, they used the same power plants as the A versions. The B1 and B3 variants were similar to the A version counterparts, other than the mentioned armament change. The B2 version was the heavy fighter variant, with different armament configurations featuring additional 20 or 30mm cannons. The B5 variant was equipped with an anti-ship radar and was able to carry a torpedo under the fuselage, and its bomb bay was used for additional fuel tanks. The B6 variant also carried the same radar, but it was a short-range variant, carrying bombs instead of a torpedo. As we mentioned, these planes could use many different weapon packs as well. The main ones were the U2 and U4 modifications, where the U2 meant two additional 20mm cannons in the bomb bay, and the U4 meant one 50mm cannon installed in the nose. Later they could use even more field modification options, like the R2, which meant two additional 30mm Mk108 cannons in the bomb bay, or the R3, meaning two 30mm Mk103 cannons in the bomb bay. The R4 modification meant two additional 20mm cannons in the bomb bay, and another two in a pod behind the bomb bay. The R5 added four additional 20mm cannons in the bomb bay, and two additional 7.92mm machine guns in the nose. The R6 modification featured again two additional 20mm cannons. Many experimental weapons were also tested on these planes, like a 210mm rotating rocket launcher, but most of these tests were unsuccessful. The rocket launchers, however, were used in underwing configurations against the Allied bomber formations. The Me-410C was a planned high-altitude version of the type, with an increased wingspan and BMW 801 engines, but it was never built. And finally, the D version was also a planned high-altitude variant, but a simpler one than the C model. Its outer wing panels were planned to be made from wood, and it was planned to be equipped with an intercept radar. Construction of this type was started, but it was never finished. The first Me-410s were delivered to the units in January 1943 and soon started flying combat missions. During this year, the already serving Me-210s were slowly replaced by the new type as deliveries continued. By the end of 1943, more than 450 planes were delivered, and they played a big role of bombing targets in England during the year. The type was also used as a bomber destroyer, attacking Allied bomber formations during the daytime raids. In April, 15 Me-410s shadowed a bomber formation all the way back to their base in England and attacked them after landing, destroying many B-24s on the ground for the loss of only one of their own planes. The twin-engine destroyers, with their heavy armament, were very effective against bombers, but they had a hard time against Allied fighters. Their success in the destroyer role was short-lived, as the bomber formations were more and more protected as time passed, and the Me-410s and other heavy fighters had no answer to the agility and numbers of the Allied fighters. Their losses started to mount and just got heavier as time passed. They still managed to successfully attack the Allied bombers, but only if they were unescorted. If the Me-410 wings were attacked by the Allied fighter escorts, their losses were always high. After July 1944, the priority of the Germans changed to the production of single-engine fighters, as the Allied air superiority became more and more prominent, and the heavy fighters could not be deployed anywhere over Germany without the risk of losing them. In September 1944, the Me-410s were withdrawn from combat, and their production was phased out, and by the end of the year they only flew reconnaissance missions. Even though the plane was a good design, which finally managed to fix the problems of the type, it appeared too late, and the events in the war cut its service life short. A total of 702 units were built, and though they didn't have a big impact on the war, and their service life was relatively short, but they were interesting designs and featured many cutting-edge technologies for the time. Chapter 6. The Junkers Ju-188. The history of the Junkers bomber family started in 1935, when Germany was in the middle of modernizing its military forces. The RLM issued new specifications this year for a new Schnellbomber, or fast bomber. The requirements were demanding for the time: a maximum speed of 500 km an hour, a bomb load of 5 to 800 kilograms, and at least one machine gun for defense. The proposals entered for the new specifications were the Henschel HS-127, the Messerschmitt Bf-162 design, which was a modification of the later Bf-110, and finally Junkers entered two of their designs, the Ju-85, which was a twin-tail bomber, and the Ju-88, which was a simpler design. Eventually, after testing, the Ju-88 model was declared a winner, thanks to its bigger bomb load and overall better design than its competitors. The prototype of the new bomber made its maiden flight in December 1936, and after numerous modified variants and years of test flights, the production of the Ju-88A series began in 1939. The production was slow at the beginning, but later it picked up, and from 1942, around 3,000 of these planes were built every year until 1945, with many different variants and specialized models. The B version of the Ju-88 was a prototype to test a streamlined stepless cockpit design, similar to the Heinkel HG-111 models. But only 10 units were built, as at that time the new cockpit design was deemed too radical. But luckily, Junkers did not stop working on these models. We will get back to them shortly. By the time the Ju-88 production started, the RLM already initiated the so-called Bomber B program, to replace the current bombers with a second generation using new stronger engines and featuring larger bomb load and higher speed and range. This program was actually started when Junkers submitted their EF-74 design to the ministry, which later became the Ju-288 model. Several designs were entered to the new program, like the Arado AR-340, the Dornier Do-317, the Focke-Wulf Fw-191, the Henschel HS-130C, and of course the Junkers 288. These large bombers were planned to use the newly developed 2,500 horsepower engines, and would have possessed similar payload and range to the Heinkel HG-177 design, but without the problems of the Heinkel bombers coupled DB606 engines, which used two engines in one engine nacelle to deliver more power in a smaller package. But the decision to base the whole program on the proposed new engine designs turned out to be a big mistake, as the constant delays in the development of these engines held back this program, even though the prototype airframes were ready by mid-1940. while the proposed engines all turned out to be costly failures. The Daimler DB604 performed under the requirements and was cancelled in 1942. The BMW 802 and 803 radial engines turned out to be similar failures, and the Junkers 222 engines were also still far from getting into production by 1942. The RLM had no backup plans in case the Bomber B program fails, so when it actually did, they decided to revisit the Ju-88B model again, as now they wasted several years and the current bombers in service started to become seriously outdated. Some of the Ju-88E models were modified to test new features, such as a new dorsal turret, new wings and tail design, and after several variations, the V-44 model received the new designation, Ju-188V1, and became the base of the new series. We can compare the shape of the new aircraft to the Ju-88 to see the design changes. The new model was about half a meter longer, had 2 meters larger wingspan, and of course the most prominent change is the new nose design. But it also received a new tail, different defensive armament, and during testing, the RLM asked the manufacturer to modify the engine nacelles to be able to accommodate either the BMW 801 engines or the Ju-213A models. The modification of the existing Ju-88 model advanced in a good pace, and in October 1942, the new Ju-188 was ordered into production, though the prototypes only started their trials early 1943, but ordering the type was not a great risk, as most of the modifications were already tested on the Ju-88E models. But as it turned out, the ministry's caution with the power plants, which was probably based on their failure with the Bomber B program, was justified in the end, as the UMO engines were delayed again, so the Ju-188E models using the BMW engines were the first ones to leave the factory in February 1943, followed soon by the A models using the UMO engines. By the end of the year, 283 Ju-188 bombers were delivered, but most of them the BMW-powered variants, as the UMO engines production stayed very slow. On the production models, the armament was changed compared to the prototypes, and the most prominent change was the 20mm cannons installed in the nose and in the turret. And that brings us to the variants of this plane. The Ju-188A1 featured no dive brakes and used the 1750 horsepower UMO 213 engines. These models featured a 20mm cannon in the nose, another 20mm cannon in the dorsal turret, a 13mm gun in the rear of the cockpit, and a twin machine gun in the gondola under the fuselage. The E1 variants were similar to the A models, but used the 1700 horsepower BMW 801 engines, and the 20mm cannon in the dorsal turret was replaced with a 13mm machine gun. The A2 variant was upgraded with newer UMO engines featuring methanol and water injection, which boosted their power to 2240 horsepower at takeoff. The A3 and A2 models were built as torpedo bombers, with the UMO and BMW engines respectively. They did not have the external bomb racks, but they could carry two 800 kg torpedoes under the fuselage, and they featured a search radar in the nose. The planned C model would have featured a remote-controlled FA-15 turret in the tail with a pair of 30mm machine guns, but the system was so unreliable, these plans were abandoned. The D and F variants were reconnaissance models. They only had a 3-man crew, the bombardier and the front cannon was removed, and photo equipment and extra fuel tanks were installed. The following G models featured a modified fuselage, which was extended with a wooden fairing to be able to carry their bomb load internally, and the manual turret in the tail was tested on these variants, but the space in the tail was so small that only very short men could get into this position, and the firing angle of the guns was very limited. As this turret failed the expectations, it was decided to use the FA-15 remote turret instead. Before these modified models could enter production, the war ended. The Ju-188H was similar to the G model, but it was a reconnaissance variant, not a bomber. The following J, K, and L models were all planned as high-altitude variants, with pressurized cockpit, more wing area, and instead of the original gondola, just having the more streamlined wooden fairing under the fuselage. The J model was designed as a heavy fighter, carrying two 30mm and two 20mm cannons in the nose. The K model would have been the bomber variant, while the L model a reconnaissance version. Before they entered service, this lineup received a new designation as Ju-388, but they retain the J, K, and L markings for the different variants. The Ju-188 was 14.95 meters long with a wingspan of 22 meters. It had an empty weight of 9,990 kilograms and a maximum takeoff weight of 15,195 kilograms. This variant was powered by two BMW 801D engines, each of them delivering 1,700 horsepower. With these engines, the bomber could reach a top speed of 500 km an hour and a cruise speed of 375 km an hour. It had a service ceiling of 9,350 meters and a range of 1,950 kilometers. The bomber's defensive armament consisted of one 20mm cannon in the nose, two 13mm machine guns in the dorsal turret and the back of the cockpit, and either a dual 7.92mm or a single 13mm machine gun at the rear of the ventral gondola. It could carry 3,000 kg maximum bomb load, including the internal bomb bay and the external racks. The Ju-188 entered service in May 1943 with Erprobungskommando 188 and KG-6, and they flew their first mission in August, attacking a factory in England. But the type entered service late in the war, and the slow production meant only 283 units were delivered in 1943 and 793 in 1944. Almost half of the models delivered were built as reconnaissance variants, and the Ju-188 served mostly on the Eastern Front and over the Mediterranean. They did not replace the Ju-88 bombers, but were directed to the same groups, and the Ju-188 models were used for missions where their increased power and range could be the most useful. But as the Allied fighter presence over Europe grew stronger, the usefulness of these planes diminished quickly. By summer 1944, the building of the Ju-188 model stopped, as by that time the Germans were desperately trying to counter the Allied bombing raids and their superiority, so most of their resources were directed to fighter production. The Junkers Ju-188, as interesting as it looks, was just an afterthought for the Luftwaffe after their Bomber B program failed. They entered service late in the war and were only produced in relatively small numbers, so they had no real impact on the events. But interestingly, after the war, the French naval aviation used them until 1951. Sadly, there are no surviving intact planes from this model today. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Please leave a like, subscribe to my channel, and in the comments let me know if there's any interesting events or vehicles you'd like to see.